Well, I did try a test film through the camera, just running the film advance and the release to make sure it functioned. I wasn't enormously happy with the way it was performing, particularly on the rewind. And it turned out that the problems with the rewind were twofold. What was happening was that the rewind lever wouldn't stay across at the rewind position. When you went to rewind the film, it instantly sprang back. That was down to two things. This spring, which returns that little pull for the rewind, that was bent out of shape. This was leg here, the angle of that leg was too steep, and I've just simply swapped it with another one. I could have straightened that out slightly. And the other thing that was causing a problem was the lever. The rewind lever itself. This has a fair degree of friction to it, and it needs to have friction to it, and that's achieved by these little tabs here being bent up slightly, and that's so that it will stay where it's put basically. There's some friction there which will hold it. Those tabs were bent down absolutely flat. I'm not sure how that happened. I know, of course, the cameras has certainly seen some abuse and people have been doing terrible things in there. But those tabs were down absolutely flat. There was no friction there at all. And as a result, this thing would just bounce back to the advanced position under the impulse of that spring, which was also bent out of shape. So that was the problem there. Now I've got the film advance working quite nicely. That was a simple enough operation. So now I can really turn my attention to dealing with that lens and shutter assembly before I put it back into the body. Right, here's the lens and shutter assembly. First things first, we'll remove this arm from the shutter release. Unscrew the rear and front lens groups. I was just looking at the state of the shutter blade in there, it's a little bit rusty. That rear group came out easily enough. What is this lens anyway? Kodak Anastigmat. Okay. And the front group, well, I think I tried to turn that earlier and had no luck. So that's going to fight me. A friction tool may work. I'm going to remove this nameplate because the nameplate just sticks up a little bit above the front surface there, and that will prevent me getting quite so much grip on that lens. Right, I've got to find a suitable spanner for that. I think I've got two options. Well, I've got this spanner that I've made at some stage. That appears to be a good fit. We'll see if that'll do the job. Yeah, it does. That was just made out of some 1/8 or 3mm aluminium, just cut to suit. The only fun is boring a hole through that's the appropriate size. Hole saws tend to jump a little bit, about 3mm a step. So I think I had to use a boring head to cut that neatly. Right, so that lens is very hazy looking on the front inside surface there. Given the apparent history of this camera, that's probably not surprising. Someone's probably had it off and been poking around in there. There's a lot of filth on that front surface. I don't know whether it shows well there. There's a lot of dirt and grease on that front surface. Well, we'll be into the shutter and let's find out what horrors lie inside. This is a 3-blade shutter. I'll just rotate this lock screw. It's actually a rivet, not a screw, just to bring that flat round the end. This just rotate this front plate, and that just relieves it from the bayonet. It's bayoneted into place with those 3 projections. This is very dirty and greasy in here. I'll unhook the spring from the main lever. Right, what have we got? Does the shutter release lever lift off? Sometimes they do, yes that does. This is quite sticky in here. I can remove this lever here. There's a spring on the inside of the case just sitting in a groove there, that'll have to lift out. That's it. And that acts as the return spring for the shutter release. Here's our high speed spring. In this shutter the high speed is 1/300th of a second. This spring is incorrectly placed. That should have been sitting around the end side, that side of that boss. Anyway, this piece here is the catch that holds the shutter in the cocked position. And that's lifted to release the shutter when you press the shutter release. This is our B lever. This is the lever that operates the blade actuating ring. It swings the blades open and closed. Those blades don't exactly park particularly well. Okay, well we can open that lot up. So there's 3 screws from the back hold the mechanism plate and the shutter case together. Now those 3 screws are identical, so you do not need to note which one of the 3 holes they came from. Alright, so here's our case with the diaphragm blades in it, and the diaphragm I note is quite stiff, and it certainly needs to be stripped and cleaned. The danger when it's stiff like that is that the blades are oily and they're stuck together, and of course if you force the lever you could damage the blades. So that's number 1. Number 2 is our mechanism plate here. You can see we've got 3 blades with long tails on the back of them. I'll see if I can move that blade actuating ring. You can see how that functions. There. Find a spot where I'm not fouling it. So I need to make note of where those blades go. This is their 3rd blade. The blade on the top. It's got a little tail here which holds it down in position just to stop it floating around. Otherwise this blade tends to flap, and if it flaps you've got a potential light path through under the edge of the blade. So that little tab there just holds that in place. Now getting some of this apart is often tricky. In an ideal world you'd have a nut driver just the right size for that brass nut, and I find a pair of tweezers will usually get you by. A pair of tweezers on its lying flat like that will get you by. And see if I can remove that. That nut also serves to hold down the blade actuating ring. It's very fine, it's very thin head on it, so you could shear that off, particularly if you're over tightening it. You could easily shear that off. we'll take that little arm off, that tab. Our 3 shutter blades. Right, so I'm going to mark this so I know where they came from. That was blade number 3. I'll put 3 small tick marks next to that. The 3 pivot screws aren't necessarily the same length, so make sure that they go back where they came from. So that's blade number 3 and its screw. This is blade number 2. I'll put 2 small tick marks there. I can see somebody else's tick mark there. What that was supposed to signify is anyone's guess. And blade number 1, we'll put a single tick mark there. Hopefully I'll be able to distinguish them when I put it back together. Alright, so I've laid out my blades in the order I've taken them off, so 3, 2, 1. This is the first one to go back on, the second, the third. Our blade actuating ring is held down by another one of those brass hex-headed screws. That should lift out. Okay, there's our blade actuating ring. At the top, here's the lever that swings the blade actuating ring backwards and forwards. We'll have that out. We'll just unhook its spring. So, could you see any of that? Probably a little bit. Let's move you forward a bit. Here's our retard gear train. Now I note that the pin here that runs against the retard gear train is somewhat mutilated looking at the top. Might mean someone's bent it and damaged it. But this speed train, I'm holding back the pallets here with my finger at this end, so holding the pallets away, and this swings in and out reasonably freely. That's quite good. Not as free as it should be, but it's a good sign. It means that the speed train's basically good. Now I've got to swab all of this carefully with naphtha, flush out the speed train with naphtha, work it repeatedly, and then blow out the naphtha so it takes away all the oil and other rubbish with it, and that would deal with that, and then we'll reassemble from there. These shutter blades, here's blade number 2, you can see how marked they are. That's oil staining in the main. There may be other marks on there. I did think I was seeing rust on one of the blades, but I'm less certain about that now because the general state of that staining's not good. If it was this blade, there is something on there that looks like rust. Hopefully not, but hopefully it's not rust. Hopefully it's just dirt. And the diaphragm. Yeah, this is very, very sticky, and these are fun to put together. So I'll deal with we'll deal with the mechanism plate first. I'll start by cleaning the mechanism plate. I'm just going to clean out inside of the lens tube there. You can see how much oil's on there. None of that should be there. and the mechanism plate itself. Got to be careful not to damage the spring here. That's the spring for the lever that works the blade actuating ring. It's awkward to take off the plate, that's why I leave it on the plate and clean around it. Around the outside edge of the lens tube here, that's where the main lever rotates, and the shutter speed settings cam plate also turns on that section, so that should normally have some lubrication, just not as much as that, and not with all the ingrained dirt and filth. I'm cleaning this top surface to make sure that's all clean. Now I get around the speed retard gear train here. This arm here, I want to push that back out of the way. There's a hairspring in here, it's easily damaged. If I hold out the pallets, swing this arm across all the way, hold it there, release the pallets, that hairspring's wound up, which means it's out of the way of the cotton bud. That means that I'm less likely to damage it when I come around here to clean it. And of course, as soon as I hit the pallets, the thing drops back in place again. I'll just check to see what sort of a job I did there. That looks pretty good. The underside of the mechanism plate, in this channel here, this is where the blade actuating ring will run. That should be clean. Will need to be lubricated. I'll lubricate that with graphite powder, but it could be lubricated with a very thin smear of graphite grease. Now, I'm not a great fan of that, or molybdenum paste or something else. I tend to use graphite powder because it's dry, and being dry it's not going to go sticky at a later date, and nor is it going to attract and hold dust and grit, which greases always tend to do. Well, that's good, that's quite clean now. The only thing I've got left to clean on here is the retard gear train itself. Normally I just flood it with naphtha. Holding back the pallets with my finger there, I'd work that action backwards and forwards. Flood it again. Blow out all that solvent, and along with it any rubbish that's picked up. And check the action. That's very snappy now, that's working nicely. So that appears to be good. Well, I've probably shifted a few oils and rubbish around, bits of rubbish around doing that, so I'll just give this mechanism plate a quick wipe around there. That is good, that's as clean as it needs to be. And of course now I need to do the blade actuating ring, which is here. I can see there's some distortion here, but it's obviously from manufacturing. They've staked in next to those cutouts, presumably to close that gap up slightly. There must have been a problem there with tolerance, I would think. That's where it picks up the rivets for these blades, and it's been staked in here and here, here and here, which would effectively close that gap up. It means that there's some slight distortion on that blade actuating ring. It's not dead flat. I'll just have to check and see how that runs. It may be no problem at all. There may be more than enough clearance there that'll run quite nicely. So here I'm cleaning this. One of the reasons I'm cleaning it is to get rid of any ingrained grease and filth that might be there. Now this only goes on in one position. Where's the lever there? The lever that operates my blade actuating ring is here, so it's that smaller of those holes. So the pin needs to come up through there. Now if I was going to lubricate this with molybdenum paste, I'd give that a wipe before I put it in place, but I'm not, so I won't. Okay, so we've got two of these small brass nuts that hold things in position. One of them also holds the third blade in position with that little tab, so I can't put that in place at the moment. I'm just cleaning this, and I'm pretty sure that came from around where blade number 1 sat, and my tick marks show me blade number 1 was over here, so that nut must have been right there. That looks right. So I've got to spin that into position. Because it's a very fine thread and it's difficult to get it started. I don't have a nut driver of a suitable size, so I'm just going to tickle this around with the tip of the tweezers till I can get it running. That's it, the thread started. Just tighten that lightly, that's good, that's all that's required. So the blade actuating ring's held down by this tab on the retard gear train and by that nut there. There'll be another nut in this position when we go to put it in place. And well, it's worth putting it in place temporarily now while I'm working on this, because I want to flip this over and put the lever on the other side. So I may just put this nut in place temporarily. That's it, that certainly doesn't need to be tight. Flip this over and find the lever, and its screw. I'll clean those. That sits right here, and I'll lubricate that with a touch of molybdenum paste before I put it in position. So the slot is where it operates the pin on the mechanism plate, and the round hole is where it pivots. Let's put a light wipe of molybdenum paste on there. This fixing screw in place. Hook the return spring in and just check that that's snappy in its action. That feels very good. That's moving nice and smoothly. I'm going to lubricate this with a bit of graphite powder. I've got some loose in this container because this is where I normally do this task. So I'll just drop some in around that blade actuating ring. And just move the blade actuating ring backwards and forwards to settle that graphite in underneath. That's all that's required. I'm going to do the same for the speed train, for the retard gear train. So I'll just drop some in on the gears. And just work that action repeatedly. I'll just tap that to knock off the excess. I'll go and blow that extra graphite away. I don't want loose powder in there.